This is Johnny Dosco. Stay tuned for another Scoresheet podcast. Holy Kadelka!
Hello and welcome to another Scoresheet podcast. Today we have with us Michael Salfino, who is a fantasy writer for Yahoo and a regular writer for the Wall Street Journal. He's been writing about fantasy for various other sites for a few years. How are you today, Michael?
Very good. Looking forward to another Scoresheet season. It's about to begin.
Yeah, baseball is cranking up. Yeah, you joined a kind of a league that we've had around for a long time, but you joined it for the first time last year, right?
I did, yes. I was a little concerned that I would be at a severe disadvantage given that I wasn't really familiar with the game mechanics that much, but it was so intuitive that didn't prove to be a hindrance. So I really enjoyed it. It was probably my favorite league.
Well, thanks. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, over the years, we get these questions from people that are like, well, I know how to play rotisserie and I know a lot about baseball, but I don't know if I'll do well in Scoresheet. And, my brother and I, our answer normally is, well, if you're a baseball fan and you think you could put together a real baseball team and do a good job, then hopefully Scoresheet's actually easier than rotisserie because we don't have the non-baseball things like categories. We just have hopefully a baseball game where if you know who a good baseball player is, he's going to help your team.
Yeah, that's the thing that I really enjoyed about it. It's liberating in a way to not have to worry so much about managerial usage. Like, obviously, there's that issue with your hitters, of course, because you need the at-bats. But it's especially, I think, much more fun as far as, like, the relievers are concerned because you're able to just get guys that you think could be useful in the role that you assign them to fill. And then, if Jake McGee, he was just ridiculous on my team until Game 7 of the World Series, which I think he blew. But it's just great to be able to just get a guy like that, figure that he could thrive in that type of role, and then just use him that way.
Yeah, I think most Scoresheet owners, even if they don't know it after their first year, after a few years, they realize you have to get a bunch of good middle relievers. And if you come over from rotisserie, Wade Davis will get you a few strikeouts, and that's about it because he doesn't get any saves. But in Scoresheet, he does just as much for you as he did for the Royals. He gets you to your closer.
Well, or he could just be your closer, and then you could just use him for multi-inning saves, and it's not really an issue because since he's pitching in middle relief, you're actually at an advantage because he has the peripherals of a top closer, but he has the innings of a middle reliever. So therefore, that gives you more innings that you could leverage during the Scoresheet season.
Yeah, no, I think that's a kind of an advanced strategy that people use now is they finally realize it doesn't matter how many saves a guy has in real life. If he pitches 90 innings and has a great ERA and a great whip, he makes a fantastic Scoresheet closer.
Exactly. And, there's other things you could do, like there's a bias in baseball, obviously, against lefty closers. I think that's a bit of a fallacy and an old school way of thinking where, there's some data that now suggests because of shifts that it's actually the righties who, have a little bit more of an advantage. I think last year was the first year ever where batting average on balls in play was higher for left-handed pitchers than it was for right-handed pitchers. But the reason why I like the dominant lefty reliever is if you find a guy like that, he's not going to have platoon disadvantages, and he's still going to be very effective when he's even facing against his opposite side. And when he's facing lefties, he's going to be especially dominant because lefties, as we all know, really have a hard time against lefties generally. So it doesn't matter so much that the guy might not be lights out, especially against his same-handed side, as long as he's, fairly solid against the platoon disadvantage. So that's why McGee, I thought, was just like a really good get last year, and it worked out great.
Yeah. Well, you bring up the lefty versus lefty. I think in baseball, it seems like it's easy to get a bunch of good left-handed hitters, especially first baseman outfielders, but you're really susceptible to a left-handed starting pitcher if you've got a heavy left-handed hitting lineup, because like you said, an awful lot of those guys, even Ryan Howard in his prime, they just don't hit lefty pitchers worth a dang.
That's exactly right. And that's the other thing. I think you have to be militant in your platooning with your hitters. Like, we don't have to worry in real baseball about things like, how the players feel about being platooned and all that things. There's no, obviously the psychological aspects are out the window, so you're just really looking to maximize performance. So even if you have a guy like I had Morneau on my team, I just didn't let him play against lefties, and obviously you can't do that in real baseball. The Rockies can't do that because the guy was like winning the batting title. You're not going to like platoon him and have him sit a couple days a week as a matter of habit. And the other thing that I think creates an advantage is it's kind of easy to get right-handed hitters who are really good against left-handed pitching relatively cheap.
Oh, you mean cheap? Yeah, cheap draft-wise, so you can
Yes.
get a few of those as. Yeah, I think at the very least in Scoresheet, you can drop a guy down to 7th or 8th in the order. And, you know, guys have egos. In real life, you probably couldn't tell Ryan Howard you're batting 8th or bench him. But in Scoresheet, you know, if for some reason you decide you have to play him, you can at least drop him down, way down in the order, and not worry about his complaining to the manager.
Exactly. Like last year, I think I did Gabby Sanchez and Morneau, and I probably had as good a first base production with that platoon as just about anybody. And Sanchez didn't even have a good year, but he had a much better year when he was facing lefties than Morneau would have had I left him in.
Yeah, well, you know, that's one thing I really dislike about modern baseball roster is these teams have 13 pitchers now on average, and so platooning in real life, you know, it's not just an ego thing. If you only have 3 or 4 guys on the bench, and at least one of them is a backup catcher that probably can't hit at all,
Yep.
managers in real life really can't platoon because they just don't have 3 extra bats on the bench that can all hit.
Exactly. And they're totally hamstrung, but we're not. We have complete liberation to do stuff like that. So that's something that we really have to take advantage of and do much more frequently than our major league manager counterparts.
Right. But on the other hand, you know, unlike a strategy in rotisserie that maybe isn't intuitive, I think most people that like baseball, you know, to play Scoresheet, most people like baseball pretty much. So we all know what platooning is. We just have to maybe convince ourselves that, oh, I know what this is. I should really use it.
Right, and a lot of times it's tough because if you're in the draft, there might be a player who has a much higher perceived value in the fantasy roto context, but he's not as valuable to your team because you might have already that starting position locked up, and you're not looking for a bench player that's necessarily going to generate a lot of at-bats. You're really looking to couple, say, that left-handed hitter with a right-handed hitter at the same position who is really good against lefties to create like sort of like a super player. But if you're sort of drafting conventionally, a lot of times it's hard to pull the trigger because the guy that you're taking is just thought of as such a scrub / spare part, like non-entity basically, and you're taking that guy over guys that actually may be on the periphery of being drafted, say, in like a mixed league.
Yeah. No, I remember that used to be in our local draft, you know, kind of be some guy would crow in the 20th round. I found a guy that's got a starting job. You know, and he'd draft him, but then the guy would hit 212 all year long.
Right, exactly.
Which, yeah, it doesn't, you know, especially if most Scoresheet leagues, you know, are like 10 teams drafting from 15 real teams. So you can't just take a guy that's an average major leaguer. You can't have too many of those guys playing for you or you're not going to win the league because the average Scoresheet team is quite a bit stronger than the average major league team.
Right. In our league, we had the full majors to pick from, but we have 24 teams in our league. So I guess that kind of like works out the same way mathematically as far as the ratios are concerned. But
24 of course, is pretty deep.
Yeah, and it's tougher because there are a lot of teams, you know, as teams start to kind of like give up on playing for the present year, rosters obviously at the top become much, much deeper, and it's much harder to get guys that are going to be useful contributors in a championship push.
Yeah, you have to have a good team to win a championship. Well, you and I were talking briefly for a minute about one other strategy of maybe trying to accumulate some prospects cheaply because they haven't really made a top prospect list yet, and then being able to trade them in mid-season or late in the season for a very useful veteran to kind of get you over the top.
Yes, because obviously the supplemental draft is going to be very tough because if you have a good record, you're picking low. It's very hard to acquire talent in the format that we use in our league, which I assume is the format that's used generally. So what I did, because I'm an avid dynasty player, so I had a lot of information on who the prospects are going to be. Like I have that throughout the season. So there's always guys that, since prospect rankings are so volatile and prospects themselves are so volatile, there's always guys that really come up from out of nowhere, and you know that they're going to be appearing on, top 100 lists and top prospect lists, and they're going to be written about as the minor league season especially starts to wind down, but they just haven't been written about yet, so they're just like sitting there for you to get. So once you get those guys, then it's easy to sell an owner who really has no interest in keeping a guy on his roster that he's not going to protect the following season, and he gets that advantage of having the rookie, sacrificing that relatively worthless last-round pick as opposed to the picks at the top of the draft after the protector. And so it just makes so much sense to get those guys. Like, you get the guy that's a prospect. Like, I got Kevin Plawecki as a catcher, with like the last pick of the supplemental draft that was kind of deep into the season. And then I needed a catcher, so then I just flipped him, and I got Russell Martin because the guy wasn't going to keep Martin, and I was going to say, Plawecki is definitely going to be a top 100 catching prospect, so it was just an easy sell.
Yeah. No, that's the way trades get made, is good trades anyhow. You find two teams that both need opposite things. One guy's out of it and he needs a top prospect. Another guy's going to be in the playoffs and needs a backup catcher and is more than willing to trade a prospect, because if you're going to the playoffs, you want to win now.
Right, and it's very hard, especially in a very sophisticated league. It's very hard to get an edge in terms of like major league players who are able to make a contribution, who are available on the waiver wire. But it's also hard for many of those owners to be up to speed on who the top upcoming minor league prospects are. It's like totally off their radar. So that's just pretty much finding, some sort of opportunity to generate some good trade value very cheaply by just going against the grain of what everybody else is trying to do, because it's much harder to play the game that everybody else is playing. You want to just play a little bit of a different game, because that way it's easier to just get things done.
Yeah, if everybody's going for the same thing, unless you're in a league of people that don't know baseball, which there aren't very many score sheet leagues like that, like you said, you're just not going to get a valuable major league player in the 39th round of drafting in July.
Right.
Those guys are gone in the 16th round in early March. Yeah. Well, so do you have a couple guys now that we're getting near baseball, maybe that think are going to be available, not the guys who are going to be protected, but maybe guys you're going to target and that you think you might be able to get because they're a little off the radar?
Well, I do. Obviously, pitching is where you're going to look first, because I think that's the most important thing in terms of winning, to have depth in the rotation and obviously have a deep and versatile bullpen. So since there's so much variance in terms of how people view pitchers, there's divergence, in other words, with like pitcher rankings and how individual people view pitchers. So it's much easier to get a guy that you really like than it is to get a hitter you really like, because there's so much convergence with the hitters that most owners tend to like the same hitters. Like, there's really no surprise hitters. So I think that's really the way to go. So again, I'm going to try to get dominant lefty relievers, starting like maybe like round even like 13, 14, 15. If I get somebody like Andrew Miller, I'm going to definitely try to get him, because, I think he's going to pitch more than a share of closer innings, and he's going to be dominant, and he's going to be dominant against righties and lefties. So he'd be a real useful guy to get. And as far as starters go, there's just so many guys to choose from. I picked up Jake DeGrom last year. I guess it was like late July. I got him, and I got him very deep into the draft because it was just at the point where his statistics weren't really that good, but I had seen him pitch because I cover the Mets a lot for the Journal, and, I'm a Mets fan. So even though his statistics didn't really suggest that he was going to be a breakout candidate, watching him, I felt that. And obviously it was good that his minor league numbers sort of masked his ability. So I was able to get him late, and now he's like a keeper for me. But if he wasn't a keeper, if he's available in a draft, he's a guy that I think is going to definitely outperform, like, say, standard fantasy rankings. The stat that I basically look at is strikeouts minus walks, and then dividing that by innings pitched. Some of the sleepers are like McHugh. I like Shoemaker. Phil Hughes is a guy that I think should be ranked pretty highly, and he's just going to be so cheap. Like, hardly anybody, I think, in most formats is going to protect Hughes. And when you get a guy who's the all-time major league record holder for strikeout-to-walk ratio, even with a fair amount of regression, I think he's still going to be a very useful asset. And he's pitching in a park, I think, that's like perfectly suited to his repertoire. So I like Garrett Richards, like, do you think he's like a surefire protect in most formats, or do you think he'll be available in many leagues?
I guess it depends on the risk. There are people that just plain won't keep pitchers once they've been hurt, which, of course, that kind of limits the pool. It's almost impossible to find a pitcher that hasn't been hurt. But, yeah, most score sheet leagues keep 13 players. So when you're keeping 13, you're talking about keeping at least 4 starting pitchers. So he'll probably be there. But so you don't just do straight strikeouts per inning. You subtract walks on the strikeout total, and then that's the number you like to look at.
Yeah, and then I divide that by innings. So basically that just gives me a number, and then I sort all the guys. Obviously there are some guys that probably were just like unlucky given that statistic, especially as far as their ERA is concerned. So you're able to get those guys. And there's also guys that, like, Shoemaker, I guess, would be the prime example, and McHugh as well, somebody who maybe doesn't have a lot of respect for a variety of reasons, like primarily velocity, I guess. But when you look at the peripherals, it's really hard to argue that Shoemaker was lucky last year given his strikeout and walk dominance. So to me, he's like a poor man's Iwakuma, and Iwakuma is probably going to be protected everywhere, and Shoemaker's probably be available in most formats. And they actually have pretty much the same velocity, and they both have that devastating splitter, which serves as a trick pitch because so few people throw it. So it's a pitch that I really like.
Yeah, it's nice to have a pitcher that kind of has that unusual thing, because major leaguers, no matter how fast you throw the ball, major league hitters can hit a fastball.
Exactly.
They catch up to that, and they scout and all that. But if you have a really dominant pitch, then you're in good shape. And then, do you pay much attention to playing time worries for pitchers, or you just figure there's going to be so many injuries in the major league level that if a guy can pitch, he's going to eventually get some innings somewhere?
I actually think, like you said, that you get the pitcher who's good, and even if he doesn't seem to have a spot in the rotation, you just wait for that spot to develop, because when you multiply the standard pitching risk in terms of extended disabled list days by the number of slots in a rotation, you pretty much have a 100% guarantee that the guy who's on the outside looking in, as far as the rotation goes, is going to be in that rotation come, June or July at the latest. So I always try to emphasize guys who they're pitching or hitting at a really good level, the volume's not there, the playing time's not there, because then all you need is for the guy to get the playing time that they deserve based on their performance in the smaller sample. And then obviously if that happens, then you have an impact player.
Yeah. Well, and especially a pitcher. If you're a third baseman and you're stuck behind an all-star third baseman, you might have to play in the minors a couple of years. But if you're a pitcher, the Washington Nationals, these people are all saying, what are they going to do with Tanner Roark now? They got 5 guys ahead of them. Well, one of those 5 will be hurt, or for some reason, odds say. I don't think having 6 really good starting pitchers is overkill by any means.
Right, or they'll just trade the guy. Like the Mets are another team that's going to probably have some pitchers who either because they're not in the major leagues at the time of the season, or maybe if some guys get really hot in the spring and they kind of use a guy like Dylan G, say, as in the bullpen as a long reliever. You got to figure at some point G is going to be able to pitch, whether he does it for the Mets or gets traded. And that's the kind of guy that's just like a useful guy to plug in there, especially if he stays in a decent park in the National League. You could figure out how to use him. And obviously you want to emphasize him in weeks where he's pitching mostly at home, and you could really just get some cheap innings with a strategy like that. But as far as the other pitchers, Josh Tomlin's a guy that I think is probably going to be available even in like every format where you're keeping even 13. Josh Tomlin is a guy, he was like 0.77 strikeouts minus walks divided by innings pitched. So that's like 0.77 more strikeouts than walks per inning, and that puts him just slightly ahead of Jordan Zimmerman, for example.
Yeah, no, guys like that have low name recognition and great stats, they're the ones you want to get, like you said, a year early. Because when they suddenly win the Rookie of the Year award or whatever, then you're not going to be able to get them unless you want to mortgage your team.
Exactly. And do you think Brandon McCarthy might be available? He's another guy I really like, especially in the National League now, in Dodger Stadium, on a good team. Like, not that really matters that much, because obviously we don't care about wins, but I think that if the pitcher is pitching for wins, I think he's going to have the kind of adrenaline that I think can propel him to better performance than if he's just losing all the time. So McCarthy's a guy that probably isn't going to be protected in most score sheet formats, who I think is going to be an extremely useful asset.
Yeah, now he's been injured so much. I think people are going to stay away from. You get burned by guys, or you get burned
Sure.
by injuries, and then you just tell yourself going to the year, I'm not taking a pitcher that has been on the disabled list 6 times or something. And then the one year they stay healthy, that's the team that makes the playoffs or wins the division or wins the crown. Because, yeah, I think Brandon McCarthy, if he ever stays healthy, is going to return great value to whoever owns him. But it is a big risk of just losing that draft pick altogether, I think, with him.
But the thing is, as you know, risk and pitching go hand in hand. So, that we just have the illusion of safety usually, and how many times has that blown up in our faces?
Yeah, no, there's no. I had Matt Cain last year. Well, he was
basically my operating principles are don't hold grudges, and never like or dislike a player, only the price.
Yeah, no, holding grudges against players can become a big mistake. Well, hey, it's been great talking to you, Michael. I don't think you and I really talked before, so appreciate you taking the time to come on with us.
Hey, it's been my pleasure. Love the game.
Well, great. Thanks very much, and good luck to your team this year.
Okay, I appreciate it.
Thanks.